Hello, my name is Jim Roberts and I'm a teacher of religious studies and have been so for quite a few years. Today I'd like to talk to you briefly about the issue of God and suffering. In my 30-odd years experience of teaching in school, I would say that this is the most common objection, the most common problem, the most common stumbling block to people believing in God. How can there be a God when he allows all this suffering in the world? And for some people it's a very personal problem. They've experienced some suffering in their life and they want to find an understanding and a purpose for it. For others it's an intellectual one. Aha! How can you fit in suffering into a God who is supposedly all-powerful and all good? Get out of that without moving. So it is a huge question, and I won't be able to answer it all by any means today. People write whole books on this, but I would like to give you, as it were, some chapter headings, some ideas of ways in which we might be able to answer this question. First of all, I find it quite interesting that in the parts of the world where there is most suffering, it is not an issue. In the parts of the world where there is a huge amount of suffering, they often have a very strong belief in God. And those parts of the world which has hardly any suffering at all, they often have a very low viewpoint of God. So there isn't an immediate correlation, therefore, between suffering and belief in God, as though somehow the more suffering there is, the less likely people are to believe in God at all. And certainly, having a religious faith and believing in God, certainly over the years, has helped many people through their suffering. They find the idea that there must be a purpose and a meaning behind it, even though they themselves are not quite sure what it is. And even though God doesn't step in and intervene and take away all their suffering, many believers find that belief in God helps them. It's a great source of strength and comfort when they are actually suffering. Also, many people say, if there was a God, he should stop all suffering. Well, let's just think about this for a moment. God should stop all suffering. Imagine a world where there is no suffering. No matter what you said or what you did, God would have to stop you suffering. A few minutes' thought will soon tell you that would be a meaningless universe. Jump in front of a bus. Don't worry. God will save you. In fact, don't bother doing anything. Don't bother going to work, because you're not going to suffer by having no money. Don't bother cooking anything. God will provide you with ready-cooked food, because you can't suffer by not eating. If you don't like somebody, you can chop their head off. It doesn't matter. They won't suffer or you won't suffer. Very soon, life choices would have no consequences whatsoever. When people hear this, they say, well, perhaps therefore I don't mean any suffering, but surely God would stop the worst kind of suffering. And immediately then we have a rather logical problem of what is the worst kind of suffering. Is it murder? Or is it murdering more than one person? And if I wanted to do the worst kind of suffering, what would then happen? Would God suddenly intervene? Would God suddenly switch the nuclear bomb off or the earthquake to stop? What would happen? In a world where God is somehow like Superman, rushing around, saving everybody anytime there's a possibility of suffering, life would very quickly become meaningless. So it's not quite as simple, perhaps, and straightforward as some people suggest. Also, some reflection on the issue would perhaps tell us that actually some suffering is necessary. It's necessary to how we develop as human beings. Because as we begin to experience discomfort, where does discomfort end in suffering? You're helping your toddler walk along, you let go so they can walk, and they fall over and cut themselves, and they suffer. Is that suffering? Is that allowed, or what? It's all difficult to know that actually some suffering seemingly is important and necessary for us and for the development of our character. Now, there is also this issue of free will. Most suffering in the world is caused by humans being nasty to other humans, whether it's on a personal level, bullying, murder, rape, or on a huge scale of genocide and murder. Most suffering in the world is caused by other humans being nasty to other humans. Now, the question is this: do we have free will? The Bible teaches that Adam and Eve were given free will. They had the ability to choose. And indeed, it's that ability to choose which makes us genuinely human. Because otherwise, you would have no real choices unless you had real free will to decide yes or no. If there was no free will, there'd be no love in the world. Because I'm sure you know that you can't make or force somebody to love you. Love, if it's going to be real love, must be freely given and rather than forced. So, to be genuinely human and not an animal or a robot or a computer, we have to have free will. If that is the case, then therefore some people can misuse their free will to do bad things. That is the downside, the flip side of having free will. People can use it to hurt and be cruel and be very unkind and cause all kinds of suffering. So that is, unfortunately, if you like, necessary. Can we blame God for it? I personally don't think you can. It's like blaming the petrol attendant who put petrol in your car and you go and drive off and have a car accident. And you say to him, well, if you hadn't put petrol in the car, I wouldn't have been able to have an accident. In the same way, God has given us free will. That's what makes us human, but we have genuine choices. And how we use that freedom is what we are accountable for. And that's what makes us either good or bad people. Now, realise that doesn't solve all the suffering in the world. There is still what we call natural suffering as well. And sometimes we humans make it worse by deciding to build cities where we know there are geological faults on the side of a live volcano. But many of those things are just the way that the world works. Otherwise, for example, things wouldn't evolve properly and all the rest of it unless we had moving tectonic plates, etc. However, there are one or two things I would also like to make out about suffering. First of all, God is not some distant deity sitting in a palace miles away, unconcerned about suffering humanity. According to the Bible, God knows what it's like to suffer. Why? Because Christians believe that God in Christ suffered. God became a human being and dwelt among us. So God understands and knows what it's like to suffer. Secondly, I'd also like to say that actually one day, Christians teach, all suffering will end. There is an end in sight. And because Christians believe that there is this world and the world to come, we cannot make a final judgment when the picture is only half painted. We still have all this afterlife experience as well. And only then can we decide that the suffering that we're experiencing here and now is actually such a big and huge problem as people make out. If this life is all that there is, then it becomes of supreme significance. And if it becomes supreme significance, then it's hugely important. But if there is another life as well, then we need to take that into account before we come to a final conclusion about God and suffering. Also, Christians are commanded to help relieve suffering. Suffering is not an intellectual problem for Christians, it is a challenge because we are told to help the poor and the needy. And therefore suffering is an incentive for Christians to go and help others. And if you look at the history of the world, you'll see many, many charities have been started off by Christians who are not concerned about heaven, but they are concerned about this world. In other words, belief in God has provided the incentive to do something about it. My own school, one of our most famous ex-pupils is William Wilberforce, who was a Christian who campaigned to change the slavery laws. And now we've got a statue of him in the school courtyard. But here's a wonderful example of suffering not being an intellectual problem, but as a moral issue which we are called upon to do something about. But ultimately, I have to admit and confess, yes, suffering is a mystery. Why does that person suffer around that one doesn't? Why do the good seem perhaps to suffer sometimes more than the bad? On a personal level, it's very difficult to explain to somebody why their grandmother or why their mother or why they suffered and died in the way they did. But what I would like to point is towards a God who understands, who became human in the person of Jesus and indeed was described as a man of sorrows. So there is great encouragement and great hope in the face of suffering.